Hello and welcome to Religious Studies 100. The topic for today's class is prophetic religion. The prophetic element in religion is one of the three fundamental elements, together with the mystical, which we already covered, and the apocalyptic or miraculous, which we will cover in the coming weeks. When we think of a prophet, we usually think of someone who foretells the future. That is the popular sense of the word prophet. But in reality, the original meaning of a prophet or prophetic religion has to do very much with the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament. And what prophets did was to call people back to God's ways. They acted as mouthpieces for God. When they deviated from his norms and his laws, then the prophets would speak. They would speak to the powerful, especially if they were making injustice. And that is the sense in which we have recovered the word prophet today for today's theology, Christian theology. It is later on through Christianity that to prophesize and to be a prophet has to do with foretelling the future. Through the Christian interpretation that some of the utterances on the part of the old Hebrew prophets were actually foretelling the coming of Christ. But that's like a later meaning, a later sense of the word. Now we go to the original meaning of the word. So for today's religion, for today's understanding of religion, a prophet is someone who gets involved with social and political struggles to implement what he considers to be God's will in the world. There is a prophetic element in all religious traditions of the world, at least in all the major religious traditions. There is definitely a prophetic element in Christianity, and a very marked one, one that is very emphasized in Islam as well. Islam is a very prophetic religion. I'm sure you're very acquainted with some of their prophetic movements, such as the Taliban. We may not think that they are doing God's will, but that's a matter of opinion. That's how we see it. They do think they are actually implementing God's will in the temporal order. Islam, as I said, is a very prophetic religion. The very scriptures of Islam, the Quran, call for a full involvement of religion in the temporal order, for no separation between the political establishment and the Quranic law. The political establishment becomes an instrument for the implementation of religion, the establishment of religion. That is not so in Christianity, not so today at least. In the past, perhaps, there may have been some of that too. But still there is a strong prophetic element, and of course there was a strong prophetic element in Judaism, particularly in ancient times, in biblical times. That's where we get the word prophet again. We can't study all forms of prophetic religion in all religions. That's impossible. Not even in Christianity. There are many different forms of prophetic involvement in political movements and social movements. So we're going to just look at a little example of prophetic religion, and that is liberation theologies. We are going to be looking at Latin American liberation theology, feminist liberation theology, black liberation theology, gay and animal theologies. Those are the examples that we're going to look at. And even those examples, we're going to have to really summarize them very much, simplify them. We're going to look at maybe one or two authors within each of these types of theologies. So that's our task for the next 3 weeks. Now, before we get into the study of liberation theologies, we need to do some background study, which will help us understand the type of analysis that we find in liberation theologies. All of these theologies are born in the late 60s and early 70s, a time which was different from our time. There was a lot of turmoil back then, a lot of protests against the Vietnam War. And not just the Vietnam War, it was just a lot of social upheaval in the US, in Europe, many parts of the world. And there was an intellectual upheaval as well. Things were in a process of change. A major generational change was taking place. Now, there are two ideologies that have a strong influence on liberation theologies. These two ideologies are Marxism and postmodern philosophy. We've talked about Marxism before. Let me say a few words today again, and then we will focus our attention on postmodern philosophy. Marxism, as I'm sure you remember, is a materialistic ideology, and therefore atheistic ideology. And what it means is that for Marxists, there is only matter, and just matter, to our existence. The universe is all that exists, and there is nothing outside the material universe. There is no God, and there is no spirit of any kind. So we are left with just matter, no soul, no independent thoughts or essential part of us that survives death. Nothing like that for Marxists. It's just our body. And so everything in our body, being material, has a material function, a material purpose. As I have explained in previous lectures, that means that the same as our hands and our fingers and our arms and our legs and our teeth and our eyes and our ears and our stomach and our liver and each of our organs has a material purpose of helping us cope better with the environment, getting more stuff for us, more food, protecting us against dangers, very practical purposes. But the same with our thoughts. For Marxism, our thoughts are just one more instrument for coping better with the environment, for getting more stuff for us, more food for us. There is nothing special, nothing independent from matter in our thoughts. That being so, every ideology, every theology as well, everything we produce intellectually, even art, has a material purpose. Now, Marxists believe that society proceeds through a process of class struggle, with an oppressor class exploiting and dominating an oppressed class, the workers, in a permanent state of conflict. That conflict will eventually give rise to a new class, which itself will become the oppressor class to another class, and a new struggle will begin, and so on and so forth. What that means is that if you have power, if you're among the powerful, the oppressors, you will use your thoughts in the same way that you use any other parts of your body to oppress the workers, those that are subordinate to you. How do you do that? Well, in the case of your thoughts, you will come up with ideologies, philosophies, theories that appear to be very sound and logic, but that the bottom line is they just disguise your interests. They're just ways of better oppressing and exploiting others for your benefit. Okay, so this is the Marxist perspective. And we'll see how this plays in liberation theologies. Let me say a few words now about postmodern philosophy as well. Let me first introduce the concept of modernity. The concept of modernity is born with the 18th century Enlightenment. That was a time when people abandoned religious and spiritualistic explanations for the things that happen in the natural world and turned to science and to very rational thinking. And they put their hopes in science. They put their hopes in science, thinking that through science we would get a better world. There would be no religious wars anymore, and everything would be resolved through pretty much a mathematical calculation. Well, if you look back to the past century and a half or 2 centuries, the last century is enough. If you were living in the second half of the 20th century and look back to the past 50 years or 100 years, precisely the time when science advanced faster, you would see that none of that really happened. None of the expectations of the 18th century people happened. You would see 2 horrific wars, the World War I and World War II, where science was at the service of the powerful and where there was more suffering and destruction than ever before in history. So the project of modernity, as it's been called by a philosopher called Jürgen Habermas, that is the dream of the 18th century enlightened intellectuals, didn't really occur. It didn't really happen. It actually turned out that science became one more instrument. Science and rationality became one more instrument in the hands of the powerful to oppress the powerless, the workers. So, big disappointment. Some thinkers came to this conclusion, to this disappointing conclusion, starting really in the second half of the 20th century, but this became more acute towards 1970 or so. And that is the time when a new movement called postmodernity begins to take shape. A name you should remember is Foucault, Michel Foucault. French philosopher who died in the mid-80s and who is taken to be the founder of postmodern philosophy. So what Foucault and others like him initiate in the 1970s is really a movement that mistrusts rationality. The same as a Marxist would not put his trust or her trust on rationality, thinking that what appears to be very rational and very logical, all of those ideologies and theories, simply disguise self-interested positions. Well, postmoderns come to the same conclusion, except that postmoderns want to know how those discourses of power are implemented, how people are colonized by those, intellectually colonized by those in power. Let's see how this happens. Let me give you a couple of examples. But let me first say something which may clarify where we're going to. For the enlightened intellectuals, knowledge is all-powerful. I'm sure you've heard this statement that knowledge is power. This is due to Sir Francis Bacon, an old British author of the late 16th and 17th centuries. Knowledge is power. It seems so obvious, right? If you know how to till the land, you'll make it productive. You know how to use a computer, you'll be more productive than if you just use a regular typewriter. Knowledge is power. You get a degree, and with your knowledge, you'll make more money. Who could deny that? Well, Foucault does. Foucault says, look, it really works the opposite way. It's power. He says, it's power that is knowledge. Power is knowledge. that requires some clarification. He really means power generates knowledge. Power determines what comes across as valid knowledge. That is what he really means. Now let me give you these examples I told you about. Say a few people in this class decide to write a letter, each of them, to a prestigious newspaper, say the New York Times. And in their letters, they state their opinion on some major political issue of the day. And they read their letters here aloud to us. And we have a vote and decide that one of those letters is the best one, and if any of them gets published in the New York Times, it'll be that letter, not the others. Then, to our surprise, one of those letters gets published, but it's not the one that we thought would be published, but one of the other letters that no one really cared that much for. Now that we see that letter in print, we look at it and we are really astonished at how good that letter was, really. How could we be so blind and so serious not to recognize the value of that letter? Now that we see it in print in the New York Times, the letter is being read in radio stations and TV stations, and important people are making comments on this letter and blah, blah, blah. So we are so impressed now with our friend here who wrote this incredible letter. Now, what no one knows is that this guy's father is best friends with the guy who selects the letters in the New York Times. And so the guy made a call to his friend and said, look, my son is sending a letter to you. Please publish it. That's how it got published. Or simply that the guy who selected the letters that day was just too tired and just didn't have time to read all of the letters people have been mailing to him, so he just picked one at random, happened to be this one, and it got published. Or he just happened to be really in agreement with what this guy said, although the letter wasn't really that good or well written. In any case, there was an act of power in there that turned this letter into valid knowledge, into true knowledge for everyone. We'll forget about the other letters. They may actually be much better than the one that got published. But good as they may have been, we don't care for them anymore. But this one got published, and so it becomes a common reference for everyone. It became important, it became true knowledge. Now, what do we see in there? We see a three-step process. The first step is selection. Someone out of a big pool of knowledge, in this case many letters to the editor, someone has the power to select a specific piece of knowledge. The second step is legitimization, what we call legitimization. Printed matter, to put it in print, that is a way to legitimize things. Of course, not all means of legitimization are equally powerful. It's not the same to have your letter published in the Season Sundial than to have it published in the New York Times. Two very different things, okay? So the degree of legitimization will vary depending on the media where it gets printed or published on TV or depending, okay? And finally, dissemination. Once your piece of knowledge, that piece of knowledge has been selected and legitimized in printed form, it's disseminated through the newspaper that gets everywhere, or the internet, or however it may be disseminated. So you have the three-step process: selection, legitimization, and dissemination. And as a result of that, it becomes absolute in the sense that it becomes knowledge that counts. So let me write the three steps in here. First, selection. Legitimization and dissemination. Let me give you another example. What do you guys call history? What kind of thing comes to mind when you think of the word history? Yes?
The past of mankind, where we have been and where we're going.
Things of the past, right?
Yeah, the past, but I guess in an imagery, kind of like just historical figures and historical events.
Right, so we have these two things mixed in our minds. On the one hand, we think that history is anything that happened in the past. On the other hand, as you say, important figures from the past. Like not everything counts as history, right?
Right.
In a sense. I mean, if I were to ask you, well, are your grandparents part of history? You would be kind of, I put you in a difficult situation because you would want to say, yes, of course. But then if I were to ask you, well, when you open a history book, how many pages do you find devoted to your grandparents? You might say, well, none. So my question is, are they or are they not part of history?
Technically, yes, they are part of human history, but...
Technically, yes, but in some other way they're not, right?
On terms of human acknowledgement and fame and whatnot, no.
So what is history? Is it human acknowledgement and fame, or is it just being part of the past? What is it?
I guess for me personally, history is anything that has taken place in the past.
Okay, so when you open a history book or a history class, there is something wrong with those things, right?
Well, yeah, the societal perspective of history is basically anything of significance that has happened in our history.
Right, so we see the same process. Yes, you have a question?
I would just say that because, yeah, it depends on how, it really is on how much history you look at, because, sure, you can't have a history book that is all the history of the world ever, of everything that ever happened.
Exactly.
You can't spend time learning everything. So
Exactly. You can't have a book that contains all of the past events, right? So that's a very good point. Well, what we see in this example is the same process at work. Who writes history? Well, someone who has the power to do it. Someone who we consider qualified to do it. A historian, an author. Yeah? He has the power to select those events and names and facts from the past that are going to count for everyone, correct?
Right.
The same, right, exactly. Like the guy who selects the letters in the New York Times, this guy also has the power to select, not letters in this case, but events and facts, names from the past. And then after that selection is made, it is legitimized. The guy writes a book, a history book. And depending on whether this guy is a famous professor or the university he teaches at, with Harvard or Yale or Oxford, and the publisher of his book, his selection will be legitimized, more or less strongly legitimized. And then it'll be disseminated. We'll buy that book and we'll call that history, correct?
Correct.
Now the bottom line is, who pays that guy to write the book? Because that guy, the bottom line is there to please someone, the one who pays him. You could make that criticism, okay? Now, there is no moral criticism in the process itself that I am describing, these 3 steps, because it has to take place, no matter what. As Ed said, it is not possible to conceive of a book that would contain every single event of every single minute in the past. That's impossible. So there's got to be a selection, no matter what. So there's nothing wrong with that. What the postmodern critic wants to know is, why are you selecting this and that fact and not other facts?
Right.
What interests are behind your selection? You see? Yes. And here's where Marxism and postmodern criticisms come together. Because the postmodern critic suspects that the selection is made to satisfy certain interests of those in power. Because only if you have power can you promote a certain type of knowledge, right? You need to be a powerful one. In their case, even in these examples I just gave you, with selecting the letters or writing the book, you have to have a certain degree of power to select what counts as true knowledge and then have it legitimized and disseminated. And that goes very much hand in hand with what Marxists suspect about all kinds of intellectual production, how it's just a disguised way of promoting your self-interests, correct? Right. Okay. Well, what about theology? Theology, people, at least people who are religious, want to think that it's an exception to all of this, that there is no class interest behind theological discourse. The theology is immune to these things. But this new movement called liberation theology says not at all, not at all. Theology, regardless of the fact that it may be talking about some eternal truth, spiritual truth, but theology is made by humans. And humans function as described by Marx and as described by postmodern critics. Now that doesn't mean that liberation theologians are atheistic. They're not, okay? They may take this part of Marxist critique of society. That doesn't make them materialistic. If they were materialistic, like if they were fully Marxist, we wouldn't say they are theologians, because a theologian is someone who believes in God. It wouldn't make any sense to talk about a theologian who is atheistic or materialistic. So without being materialistic or atheistic, they still take this element from Marxist criticism because they find it enlightening. They find it useful. And so, as we will see, liberation theologians apply this Marxist type of element and this postmodern inspiration to the way that theology is made and the way theology has been made throughout history in the Western world. That is pretty much all I want to say in this lecture, which is specifically a lecture to prepare you for the study of liberation theologies in the coming weeks. Thank you. Hello and welcome to Religious Studies 100. The topic for today's class is gay liberation theology and animal liberation theology. These are the two final examples of this part of the semester that we've devoted to this form of prophetic religion that we call liberation theologies. We've studied Latin American liberation theology, feminist and black liberation theologies. And in these three theologies, we saw that there is a common pattern to all of them, what you would call it a common denominator, which is they're seeing society as a system in conflict. They approach society with what we call systemic analysis, with two classes in a permanent state of conflict, in a permanent state of struggle. And they are more concerned with what we call orthopraxy than with orthodoxy. Remember, orthodoxy, the right opinion, having the right understanding of the scriptures, which is the traditional concern of theology, versus orthopraxy, doing the right thing regardless of your denomination or any division within Christianity. Well, with gay theology and animal liberation theology, we go back to orthopraxy. I've classified them as liberation theologies because they deal with groups of either humans in one case or living beings in general in the other that somehow are in need of liberation, okay? But the theology itself does not match the same pattern as the previous three theologies that we studied. These ones are more concerned with, as I said, interpretation, right understanding, orthodoxy. Before we get to gay liberation theology properly, because homosexuality is such a controversial issue, let me, as a form of background, let me discuss the matter of homosexuality so that we know at least what we are talking about. Generally, we understand by a homosexual person, a person who feels attracted to people of his or her own sex. Well, today, that understanding has become a little too narrow. What we think today of as a gay or a lesbian person is someone who has a particular personality constellation. In other words, attraction to someone of one's own sex is just one more expression of a personality constellation that includes many more things. It's just the most visible aspect, but that's all. It's just one aspect. You see how important this is. Now, before the mid-19th century, homosexuality was conceptualized as a sin, exclusively as a sin. There was no understanding of a person having a permanent orientation of his personality or her personality that we would call today homosexuality or homosexual person. It was just a sin. It was something some people did occasionally out of sinfulness, maybe curiosity or just sheer depravity. Then in the mid-19th century, in the medical world of the German-speaking countries, specifically Austria, this new concept of homosexuality begins to take shape, and the very word, strange word, homosexuality, is coined. And because this happens in the medical milieu, it is conceptualized as a mental illness. And then once it is conceptualized as a mental illness, the next step, the next logical step, is to try to find a cure, a treatment at least for it. Right? And that's what happened. And so starting in the late 19th century, we get all kinds of treatments that attempt to turn homosexually oriented persons into heterosexuals. Some of those treatments were hormonal treatments, psychological treatments, such as psychoanalytical treatments, behavioral treatments. They all failed. For one thing, the amount of hormones we find in a homosexual man are the same as found in a heterosexual man. So the amount of male hormones are the same in the one and in the other. So that in itself failed. And the same applies to women. There's no more hormonal imbalance. Freud was one to categorize homosexuality as an arrested state of development. In other words, not a disease, not a mental illness, but someone who hadn't really fully matured sexually, so to say. And so he tried to change that, to change those people through psychoanalytic treatment. It failed too. Then there were the behavioral treatments, in which a homosexual person would be exposed to kind of Pavlovian stimuli. And so a positive heterosexual stimulus would be reinforced by asking the person to masturbate, for example, what's in a heterosexual imagery. While at the time that the person was seeing homosexual imagery, he or she would be given electroshocks or injected substances that would make them sick, so that the person would associate homosexual imagery with something sickening and painful, and heterosexual imagery with something pleasurable. Well, that failed too. And there were even treatments that included brain surgery. But the fact is, there is not a single case on record, not one single case on record of proven change from homosexuality to heterosexuality. But we don't even need to look at those treatments. We know that many homosexual men and homosexual women throughout the 20th century have married people of the opposite sex under the mistaken advice of pastors and counselors and psychologists that if they had sex with someone of the opposite sex repeatedly or maybe exclusively, they would become heterosexual. It didn't happen. And you all know the stories of this 60 or 70-year-old man finally coming out of the closet after being married for 30 or 40 or 50 years and having children and grandchildren. So whatever homosexuality is, whatever the wrongly called sexual orientation, let's just call it personal orientation is, it doesn't change. It seems to be fixed from early age, perhaps from birth, and it doesn't change, doesn't seem to change. no treatment, no experience of any kind will make it change. We know that there are heterosexual men and women who have homosexual relations in context of prostitution, for example. They get paid to do that. They do not become homosexual. They do not even become bisexual. They simply develop a tolerance for same-sex sexual activity in the same way that homosexual men who marry women develop a tolerance for opposite sex sexual activity, but they never become straight, heterosexual, or bisexual in any way. So that doesn't change. Furthermore, if that could be changed, then I venture to say there would be no gay people at all. They would have changed to heterosexuality. Not because there is anything wrong or sick about being gay or lesbian, but because social pressure and repression and fears and marginalization are so strong on homosexual people that any teenager, any person being 13, 14, 15, and realizing that they were gay or lesbian would immediately change and not face that kind of suffering and marginalization. But it doesn't happen. People cannot change that, neither one way nor the other. The next question is, how many homosexual people are there? What is the incidence of homosexuality? Well, the most extensive study we have up to date was done by Alfred Kinsey and his team in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s. He did two major studies on male homosexuality and female homosexuality, one on each, one on male homosexuality, the other one on female sexuality. When you see these reports, they're 800-page long, each of them. He used tens of thousands of interviewees for his studies. They took decades to complete. It was done in a very scientific and systematic way, although he was later subjected to criticism of various kinds, but some of them without really a justification. What he found out was that for men, the incidence of homosexuality is approximately 10 to 12%. And if we include bisexual men, then it goes up to about 18%. And for women, the incidence of homosexuality is about half that of men. Now, later studies have found a lower incidence of homosexuality, but they all agree that the incidence of homosexuality for women is always about half that of men. Now, I should say that later studies have used a far, far smaller sample than Kinsey. So Kinsey used about 40,000 interviewees, men and women altogether. After Kinsey, the most extensive study, one by the University of Chicago in the mid-1990s, used altogether less than 6,000 subjects, 6,000 interviewees, which means it's a much, much smaller sample than that used by Kinsey. Now, homosexuality is also a very politicized subject, okay? It does matter very much to know how many homosexual people there are in society. We may think, well, it doesn't matter. Each individual has his or her rights regardless of whether it's a large minority or small. Well, the fact is, in real politics, it does matter how many homosexual people there are or how many people belong to a certain minority, generally speaking. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association dropped homosexuality from their diagnostics and statistics manual. And by the mid-1990s, the World Health Organization followed suit. Okay? So now, before 1973, homosexuality was officially considered to be a mental imbalance, a mental illness. From 1973 on, that changed. the change was due in part to the fact that times were changing in every respect. So what was before believed out of prejudice or simply religious convictions had to be revised in the light of science. Okay, with this little background about homosexuality, let's move on now to gay theology. The names that I want you to remember for gay theology are John Boswell and John McNeill. John Boswell was the chair of the history department at Yale University. He died in the mid-1980s, and he is the author of an award-winning book, a major piece of historical research, entitled Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality. John McNeill is a former Jesuit priest, Catholic priest, and also the author of a book called The Church and the Homosexual. Now, they are not the only two authors in the field of gay theology or gay liberation theology. There are many, many more and many more books. We just don't have the time to deal with all of them, okay? And especially because these two authors represent the major theories and theses in this field, which are then used and discussed by other authors. Now, let's see first what the Bible says about homosexuality, or does it say anything about homosexuality? As a question. The Bible talks about same-sex sexual activity. Let me read chapter 19 in Genesis, where the story of Sodom is recounted, and then we'll discuss it. Okay? We are told that Lot was a just man who lived in this depraved city of Sodom, which would be later destroyed by God, and that he one day received the visit of two angels in the form of men, and he invited them over to his house to spend the night there. And then the men of the city of Sodom, knowing that he had two male visitors, surrounded his house and demanded that he give them up, that Lot gives them up, so that they could know them. Now the word know, sometimes, less often than many people think, in the Hebrew scriptures, has the meaning of having sex, having sexual relations with someone. And then we'll see what happens, okay? So the two angels came to Sodom in the evening. This is again Genesis chapter 19. The two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He bowed down his face to the ground. He said, "Please, my lords, turn aside to your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you can rise early and go on your way." They said, "No, we will spend the night in the square." But he urged them strongly. So they turned aside to him and entered his house. And he made them a feast and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man, surrounded the house. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, so that we may know them." Lot went out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." Then they pressed hard against the man Lot, and came near the door to break it down. But the men inside reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. And they struck with blindness the men who were at the door of the house, both small and great, so they were unable to find the door. Well, there are a number of things in this passage that really, I think, call our attention. First of all, we wonder what kind of morality is that allows Lot to offer his 2 virgin daughters to the men outside to do with them as they please and just leave his guests alone. We wonder about that. I mean, as an example of a moral family, it kind of brings some questions into our mind. Let me say that when the city is destroyed and Lot leaves the city following God's orders, he's the only one that's saved. And he leaves the city with his wife and his daughters. Well, his wife becomes a statue of salt because he turns her head back, and God told them not to look back. But then he goes into the wilderness and lives there with his 2 daughters. Lot lives there with his 2 daughters in a tent. And at one point, Lot's daughters decide that they need men. They need to procreate. There are no men around. And so they come up with the idea, which they carry out, of getting their father drunk and having sex with him. And so they do, one after the other. So anyway, one wonders about the morality of this family, of this exemplary family. But anyway, that's not the point for our discussion today. What calls your attention in this passage? Can any of you tell me if there is anything in this passage that you find surprising, besides the fact that Lot offers his 2 virgin daughters to the crowd?
Well, I'd say it's just an interesting concept, the fact that like there's an entire what sounds like an entire town that wants. Exactly.
Very good. What he said is, what calls his attention is the fact that the whole town seems to be surrounded Lot's house. Let's imagine all of the men. Let's leave the women aside. Now that we talked about the Kinsey studies and later studies on homosexuality that put the incidence of homosexuality at 10%, maybe 18% at most, in counting bisexuals and everything, could all of the men of the city be homosexual? Very unlikely. I mean, we don't know of any place like that, not even West Hollywood or San Francisco or any place like that, right? Could all of the men of the city be homosexual? Well, the answer seems to be no. So Boswell says, this episode in Genesis, if it is talking about homosexuality, homosexual relations, homosexual sex, same-sex sexual activity, I shouldn't use the word homosexuality yet. If it is talking about that at all, it is talking about heterosexual men or presumed heterosexual men doing something which is against their nature, something sinful. Not about homosexual men, because not all of the men in the city could be homosexual. Now, remember this point, because this is the point that Boswell is going to make over and over when dealing with other biblical passages. The biblical authors had no understanding of what we call homosexuality, of a permanent orientation of the personality. In biblical times, the understanding was that a person's sexual orientation went hand in hand with his gender or her gender. A man was attracted to a woman to a man. And so if a man had sex with another man, he must be doing that out of sinfulness, sheer depravity, corruption, not because he has strong drive, a special attraction, okay? So that makes for very different judgments, okay? It's not the same to judge, say, a heterosexual man who has sex with another man because he gets paid to do that, as to make a judgment on a homosexual man who falls in love with another person of his own sex. It's 2 very different things. Morally speaking, the amount of responsibility and the type of responsibility is bound to be different. Now, this is the argument by Boswell. It applies to this passage here and to other passages we're going to be talking about now. The biblical authors had no understanding of homosexuality. They didn't know there were homosexually oriented people. Their understanding was that everyone was heterosexual. Therefore, when they talk about same-sex sexual activity, they are addressing the sin of heterosexual people or presumed heterosexual people who are having sex with people of their own gender out of depravity, sinfulness. They are not talking about homosexual people because the very concept did not exist then. It came into existence in the mid-19th century. As we will see, the church does not agree with Boswell, but that's a different matter, and we'll discuss that also. Okay? We have another passage, another couple of passages in the Old Testament, in the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, verses 20 to 22. Okay? You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. This chapter 18, verse 22 on Leviticus. And then again in chapter 20, verse 13, it says, if a man lies with a woman, with a male, if a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood is upon them. Well, a couple of things here. First of all, it's talking about a man lying with another man, a male with another male as with a woman. Not necessarily homosexual people, but just presumed, as Boswell would put it, and McNeil, presumed heterosexual males lying with other males as with a female, as with a woman. So the same criticism applies here. But also the death sentence, what about that? It seems really strong for even for a sin on the part of heterosexual men. Well, we can't be selective with this. The death sentence is prescribed for so many things in the Old Testament that not even in the times of Jesus it was strictly applied. And today, not even the most Orthodox Jews would apply the death sentence in all of the cases prescribed in the Old Testament, including, for example, working on a Sabbath, being a disobedient son, disrespecting your parents. All of those things have the death sentence as a punishment. Well, it has never been applied in full like that as far as we know. And so we can't be that selective in saying, look, same-sex sexual activity was such a terrible thing that it was punished with the death sentence, because many other things were punished with the death sentence, at least nominally in text, but it's doubtful whether it was truly ever applied rigidly. Okay. Now in the New Testament, we have a couple of passages, but I'm just going to mention one by St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, in which he's talking about pagans, the pagans he sees in Greece, in places like Greece where homosexuality was open, where same-sex sexual activity was open, permitted, and even celebrated, socially accepted and celebrated. He's scandalized by that because he's not used to seeing that. And he's attacking them because of their paganism, their worshiping of different gods and statues and stuff like that. Okay? And so he says that claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles. So he's talking about the pagan religion and pagans. Therefore, God gave them up in their lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the degrading of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to degrading passions. Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural. And in the same way, also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons the due penalty for their error. Well, a couple of things again. Again, St. Paul from the point of view of John Boswell and McNeill and others, is talking about heterosexual men doing what is unnatural for them as heterosexuals. He doesn't seem to have a particular understanding of what homosexuality as a permanent orientation is. And it presents this as a choice. Men exchanged and women exchanged what was natural for the unnatural. Well, when you exchange something, it seems you are responsible for your decision, for your choice, which is not the case with homosexually oriented persons. And also, in this particular passage, this wrong choice that pagans made is presented as a punishment for their paganism, for their not worshiping the true God and worshiping idols, statues, and animal gods and stuff like that. Of course, that wouldn't apply today. We don't have pagans today. We don't have anyone worshiping idols and false gods or statues of animals or stuff like that. Okay? So, as for the biblical texts, what you need to remember is that from the point of view of this gay liberation theology, Boswell and McNeill, the biblical authors had no knowledge or understanding of what we call today homosexuality, of a person truly, emotionally, strongly driven, attracted to someone of his or her own sex. For the biblical authors, their understanding was that everyone was naturally heterosexual, and therefore, if they had sex with someone of their own sex, they were just sinning out of sheer sinfulness, depravity, and it was something which in the New Testament is linked to their paganism, to their not worshiping the true God. Now, what is the position of the church concerning this matter? I'm going to talk about the Catholic Church, the biggest Christian body, which pretty much in her position coincides with most Protestant denominations. Well, for the Catholic Church, all same-sex sexual activity is sinful. So they have this straight reading of the biblical passages, no particular exception or consideration for a person's psychological makeup, but rather simply the facts. Having sex with someone of your own sex is a sin. Now, being gay or lesbian is not a sin. So a gay person or a lesbian is no more of a sinner than a heterosexual person. But acting on it, acting upon it sexually, that is a sin. That is the position of the Catholic Church. At the same time, interestingly, the Catholic Church recommends great caution when making moral judgments on gays and lesbians. Because although what they do has the appearance of sin, remember the difference between the formal and the content, what appears to be and what is really something. Some things may appear to be sinful, but the degree of moral responsibility may not be there. There may not be true moral responsibility, despite the appearance of moral responsibility. I'm going to give you an example now, which we may have discussed in the past. So the church cautions against rushing to judgment. And so the bishops say that behind that appearance of immorality in gay sex or gay promiscuity, or however you want to conceptualize it, there may be less sinfulness or even no sinfulness at all, given the special circumstances that the gay person lives under, of oppression, repression, fears, shame, marginalization. So yes, the Catholic Church says, yes, those acts, we have to say they are objectively sinful. Objectively means that they have the form of sin. But at the same time, let's not rush to judgments, because only God knows if there is truly sin behind those acts. Now let me clarify the distinction between the formal and the material. For everything for which we can make a moral judgment, there are two aspects. For every human activity, there is the formal aspect and then the material aspect. What appears to be and what really is. What appears to be, we call it formal or objective. And what really is, we call it subjective, or the content, the true essence of the fact. Let's imagine that two students in this class have the same kind of whatever, iPod or iPhone or iPad or whatever. And say on a specific day, one of them brings his iPad, but the other one forgets her iPad home. After class, everyone leaves. The person who brought his iPad forgets his iPad in the classroom. And the person who forgot her iPad at home, when walking on campus, like 5 minutes after leaving class, is looking for her iPad, and she thinks she left her iPad in the classroom. So she comes back, and she sees an iPad, which looks exactly like hers, on a desk. And so she thinks to herself, oh, this is my iPad. And she grabs her iPad and walks away with it. Now, all of this is being recorded by the security cameras. Then the student who actually left his iPad in class comes back, and the iPad is gone. So he goes to the police. And the police view the recordings, the videotapings. And they see the other student coming into the classroom and grabbing this student's iPad, and walking out with it. Well, what is it gonna like? What is it gonna look like to the police when they see this? It's gonna look like the student who came after class and grabbed the iPad that the other student had left on his desk was actually stealing it. Formally, objectively, that looks like stealing. Now, we know better, because in this case we play God, and we know that this person was not stealing the iPad, that she honestly thought that was her iPad because she has one exactly like it, and it's at home, and all of this. So here you have the difference between the objective and the subjective in a very simplistic example. Something may look like actually sinful, but in reality may not be sinful at all. There may not be moral responsibility at all. Right? Well, of course, that's a very simple example. As I just told you, I can give you a little more of a sophisticated illustration of this. Let's imagine two students here. Let's see, Ed and Mary. And say Ed is a rich kid who has lots of money. He has so much money, he doesn't know what to do with it. He spends his life having parties with his friends. While Mary is barely making it by working at McDonald's 12 hours a day, making $2 an hour. And so she finally, due to the crisis, loses her job at McDonald's, has no money, and now she's pushing her supermarket cart in the streets. And she runs into this huge party that Ed is giving for his friends. There's so much food in there, not even the dogs they have in there won't eat any more food. They're just going to throw it to a trash can. And this food is really expensive, because they've used this Beverly Hills catering service. So a little piece of chicken or turkey or whatever is really expensive. And Mary, who's starving, runs into this party. There's this food there by one side of one table, and she grabs some, puts it in her supermarket cart, and runs away with it because she needs it for survival. Now, what do we call what she did? In appearance, formally, what is it? Stealing, thank you. Stealing. It looks like it still has the form of stealing. She's appropriating something which does not belong to her without the permission of its lawful owner. Stealing. Now, you know what Ed likes to do, the rich kid? There is something he really likes to do. He really enjoys, makes him happy doing this. He likes to drive his convertible BMW at night in downtown LA, in Skid Row, where all the poor people, the homeless people have been begging out in the streets, are lying at night there. And when he sees one of these homeless persons counting the little money he or she made during the day by begging in the streets, you know what he does? He stops his car, he gets out of his car, grabs the money, and runs away with it in his BMW. And he loves doing that. That makes him so happy. That's really his secret hobby. He loves it. He's happy doing that. Now, what do we call that? Stealing too, right? Stealing. Now, I tell you, the money that Ed would manage to steal from the homeless was much, much less than the value of the food that Mary stole from Ed at his party, which Ed, by the way, didn't even notice. Okay, just that piece of turkey she stole from him was worth, $100 because of this expensive catering system. But Ed was only able to steal $12 from the homeless. So, technically speaking, you would say Ed has a bigger responsibility because, Mary has a bigger moral responsibility because she stole a bigger value. But we all know that that isn't the case. We all know that behind and beyond the appearance of a stealing on the part of Mary, there is most likely zero moral responsibility, zero sinfulness. Although what she did looks like a stealing. While in the case of Ed, although he only managed to steal whatever, $7, $10, $5 even, what he does is very sinful. So circumstances will give us the basis for a moral judgment. And so in that sense, the Catholic bishops say it is not the same for a heterosexual man to have sex with another man out of greed, money, depravity, curiosity, whatever it is, than for a homosexual man. So the bishops still say in both cases their acts look like sinfulness, look like sin. They are sinful. Objectively speaking, they look like sinful on the surface. But let's not rush to judgment because under the appearance of sinfulness, in the case of homosexual men, given the conditions they live in, homosexual men or homosexual women, given the conditions they live in, there may be less sinfulness than we think, or maybe even no sinfulness. Okay, so these are the two positions for gay liberation theology. Let's move on now to animal liberation theology. I'm just going to tell you a few words about animal liberation theology. It's not a very prominent kind of theology, but some people are working at it. And the name that I want you to remember is Andrew Lindsay. Andrew Lindsay is an Anglican priest and an author, a prolific author. He's written books such as Animal Gospel, Animals and Christianity, etc., Animal Theology. Let me make only a couple of points in here. On the one hand, this theology is concerned, the same as with gay theology, with getting the right interpretation from the scriptures. Now, what that means in the case of animal theology is, what do the scriptures say about animals? Well, for one thing, we are told that man is given dominion over the animals in Genesis, in the book of Genesis. What does dominion mean? Well, the word dominion has been interpreted in different ways. Man was given dominion also all over his children. Now, to have dominion over your children doesn't mean you can kill them or abuse them or beat them up or enslave them. However, that is the way in which the word dominion has been interpreted in the case of animals. And so Lindsay advocates a reinterpretation of this passage, of this word, with dominion really meaning stewardess, stewardship, caregiver, having dominion being to be a caregiver, to be a steward of God's creation, God's creatures. Andrew Lindsay has what is called an indirect theory of animal rights. Let me explain what an indirect right is. Or right, rather than indirect right, I should say indirect obligation. That's a clearer way of understanding this concept. I have a direct obligation to respect other human beings. I cannot abuse them, not because they belong to anyone, but because of who they are. However, I do not have a direct obligation to respect the well-being of a car or a computer. If I were to find a computer or a car in the middle of the desert with a legal notice that says this car, this computer belongs to no one, I could destroy it. I can buy a computer and just destroy it. I'm not going to be sent to prison for it'd be a fool thing to do, but I can spend my money on a computer and then smash it the next day. Nothing's going to happen to me. No neighbor is going to call the police or denounce me or nothing. Nothing's going to happen. So those things do not have rights in themselves. However, I'm bound to respect a computer because it belongs to Ed or to Mary or to Peter. So I have an indirect obligation towards those objects because they belong to someone else. That is what we call the indirect theory of duty, of human duty, of moral duty. So in the case of animals, Andrew Lindsay says, we have an indirect obligation to God. They belong to God, and therefore, although we have no direct duties to them, our duties are indirect because they belong to God. All life belongs to God. That explains why there could be animal sacrifice in the Old Testament, because if life belongs to God, God can always reclaim what belongs to him, but we cannot destroy it because it doesn't belong to us. So by respecting the life of animals and the well-being of animals, we are actually respecting God's rights to his creatures. That is the essence of his theory. Thank you.